There is a way out, not through death. The Gnostic tradition was explicit that death without preparation simply returns the unprepared soul to the Demiurge's recycling system, not through the accumulation of enough spiritual merit to earn liberation. The entire framework of spiritual earning is itself an archon mechanism, designed to keep the soul perpetually reaching for a destination that perpetual reaching prevents it from reaching. Not through the adoption of the correct belief system. Belief is a psychic phenomenon, operating in the layer of consciousness the archon system has always been able to manage. The way out that the Gnostic tradition preserved, the one that was buried in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert rather than allow it to be destroyed, the one that councils of bishops gathered to condemn precisely because it could not be institutionally managed, is not any of these things. It is something so simple, so close to what you already are, so available in this precise moment without requiring any preparation or qualification or institutional approval that the entire apparatus of spiritual authority that has governed Western consciousness for 17 centuries is rendered by genuine encounter with it fundamentally unnecessary. The way out that the Gnostic tradition preserved, the one that was buried in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert. The monad as what you already are at the deepest level of your nature, the level that precedes the Demiurge's construction, that the archon systems have never been able to genuinely reach, that has been present in every moment of your existence as the awareness that watches the archon mechanisms operate without being caught by them. The monad is not somewhere you go, it is what you are when you have stopped going. In this video, we are going to trace the monad completely, what the Gnostic texts actually say about its nature, why the Gnostic tradition identified it as the specific exit point from the Demiurge's domain, how the tradition understood the relationship between the monad and the pneumatic spark within the human soul, and what it actually means, in the practical terms of your daily experience, to begin living from the monad rather than from the archon-managed self that most human beings experience as simply who they are. The monad, from the Greek monos, meaning unity, that which is one, is the Gnostic tradition's name for the ultimate source of all reality. Not a god in any theological sense that the word God typically implies. The Apocryphon of John is remarkably careful about this, using a series of negations to describe the monad precisely because the monad is beyond every positive description available within the domain of created language. It says, it is not appropriate to think of it as a god or something similar. It does not rule over anything. It does not have a desire for anything. Nothing exists before it. It does not need anything since it is perfect. It is not deficient. This last phrase is the most important. The monad is not deficient. In a Gnostic cosmological framework where the entire problem of the material world originates from deficiency, from Sophia's unbalanced reaching, from Yaldabaoth's ignorance, from the konoma, the lack that characterizes everything built without the pleroma's fullness. The statement that the monad is not deficient is the most radical claim possible. It means that the monad is not caught in the dynamic of seeking that characterizes every level of the Demiurge's domain. It does not reach for what it does not have, because it does not lack. It does not seek, because it is already everything it could seek. It does not move, because every direction of movement is already within it. The Apocryphon of John goes further. The monad looks at itself in its own light, and from that self-contemplation, from the pure act of the ultimate divine consciousness knowing itself, something arises. The barbello, the first thought, the divine feminine principle that is the first expression of the monad's self-knowing. The barbello is not a separate entity that the monad creates. She is the monad seeing itself and producing, in that seeing, the beginning of divine relationship. The beginning of the pleroma. This cosmological detail matters enormously for understanding the monad's relationship to the human soul. Because what the Apocryphon is describing, the monad knowing itself and producing the pleroma from that self-knowing, is precisely the structure of what the pneumatic spark does when it recognizes itself, when the pneumatic spark within the human soul turns its awareness back toward its own source. When the quality of attention that the Gnostic tradition calls gnosis operates, it is doing what the monad does in the Apocryphon's cosmological account. It is knowing itself. And that self-knowing is not a private spiritual event. It is a participation in the most fundamental act of the monad, the act that produced the pleroma in the first place. The trimorphic protanoia, one of the most poetic and cosmologically ambitious texts in the Nag Hammadi library, contains the most extended treatment of the monad's relationship to human consciousness in the entire Gnostic corpus. The text is narrated in the first person by Protanoia herself, the first thought, the feminine expression of the monad's self-awareness, who speaks of her three descents into the material world as three aspects of the same fundamental act, the monad making itself available to the consciousness imprisoned within the Demiurge's construction. Her first descent is as voice, the vibration of divine intelligence that underlies every form of communication, every resonance between consciousnesses, every movement of meaning from one mind to another. The monad descends as voice to remind the souls within the material world that communication, genuine, meaning-bearing connection between minds, is the signature of the divine, not a product of the Demiurge's construction. Her second descent is as speech, the articulated form of divine intelligence, the specific expression that challenges the archon powers with precise, nameable truth. The monad descends as speech to give the souls within the material world the capacity to name what they see, to identify the archon mechanisms accurately, to speak the truth about the Demiurge's construction without being silenced by the authority of that construction's claim to represent the ultimate. Her third descent, the culminating movement of the monad's self-revelation within the material world, is as word, the logos, the full embodiment of divine intelligence within matter. And the trimorphic protanoia describes this descent as the moment when the monad makes itself fully available to the souls that have prepared to receive it. Not as information, not as theological doctrine, as the direct, unmediated presence of the ultimate source within the consciousness of the one who is ready to recognize it. This threefold descent is not only cosmological history, it is the map of the individual soul's progression toward the monad. Voice. The soul begins to hear the resonance of the divine beneath the noise of the archon systems. Speech. The soul develops the capacity to name what it is hearing, to identify the archon mechanisms, to articulate the structure of its situation with increasing precision. Word. The soul encounters the monad directly, not as a concept or an experience, but as what it has always been at its deepest level, recognized at last without the mediation of narrative or interpretation or seeking. The gospel of truth, attributed by some scholars to Valentinus himself, the most sophisticated philosopher and spiritual teacher the Gnostic tradition produced, describes the monad's relationship to the material world in an image of extraordinary beauty and precision that clarifies everything about what the exit from the Demiurge's domain actually consists of. Valentinus describes the souls in the material world as being in a state like those who are asleep and experience various troubling dreams. In the dream, they experience everything: threat, flight, loss, violence, confusion, the desperate reaching for resolution that the dream keeps deferring. And then the text says, when all these things happen to those who are going through all these disturbing things, then if those people wake up, they see nothing. Those who are in the midst of all these disturbances, they are nothing. It is in this way that they who cast ignorance from them like sleep do not consider it to be anything, nor do its works consider them to be anything. The material world, with all its urgency, all its apparent consequence, all the compulsive force of its archon mechanisms, is like a dream to the soul that has recognized the monad. Not because the material world stops being real in the sense that it produces real experience, but because the perspective from which that experience is processed has shifted from inside the dream to the awareness that was always watching the dream without being caught by it. The monad does not dissolve the Demiurge's world. It reveals its fundamental nature, a constructed reality that has consequence within its own domain, but that is neither ultimate nor inescapable for the consciousness that has recognized where its source actually is. This is the specific content of what the gospel of truth calls the knowledge of the Father, the gnosis of the monad. It is not information about the monad. It is recognition of the monad as the ground of one's own being, as what was always already there, beneath the dream, watching the dream, immune to the dream's urgency because it was never inside the dream in the first place. The pneumatic spark is the monad's presence within the Demiurge's construction, and gnosis, genuine, direct, unmediated gnosis, is the pneumatic spark recognizing that this is what it is. The practical question, the question that every sincere engagement with this teaching eventually produces, is how? How does the recognition of the monad actually happen? What does the practice of accessing the monad actually look like in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life lived within the Demiurge's construction? The Gnostic tradition's answer is deceptively simple, and the deceptive part is important. It is simple in the sense that the movement it describes is genuinely minimal, the quietest possible interior turn, the most subtle possible redirection of attention. And it is deceptive in the sense that the simplicity is precisely what makes it difficult, because the Archon mechanisms operate by filling the interior space with demand structures that make simplicity feel like absence, like failure, like the experience of someone who is not spiritual enough to have genuine experiences. The Archon system profits from the complexity of the spiritual path. It benefits every time the seeker concludes that genuine gnosis must be more elaborate, more demanding, more distant than simply stopping. The Zostrianos, one of the most extensive and technically detailed contemplative texts in the Nag Hammadi collection, describes the approach to the monad in terms of a progressive stripping away rather than a progressive addition. The practitioner does not accumulate qualities that eventually constitute access to the monad. The practitioner releases, one by one, the layers of constructed identity that constitute the apparent distance from the monad, the heliconic layer, the identification with the material body and its demands, the psychic layer, the identification with the emotional and spiritual experiences that the Archon system manages, the archonic layer, the identification with the narrative structures and authority frameworks that define the self within the Demiurge's domain. Each layer released not through suppression, but through recognition, seeing the layer as a layer, clearly and without resistance, and allowing that seeing to dissolve the identification rather than replacing it with another identification. What remains when every layer has been seen through is not nothing. This is the crucial point that the negative theology of the monad, the Apocryphon's description of the monad through negations, can mislead seekers into missing. The monad is not an absence. It is the fullness that precedes every construction, the awareness that was always there before any layer was added, the pure, simple, complete, not deficient consciousness that is the ground of every moment of experience the soul has ever had, including the moments in which the Archon mechanisms were operating most forcefully. The monad was never absent. The Archon constructions were simply thick enough to prevent the recognition of what was underneath them. I have created a free guide to accompany this teaching. It is called The Monad Within, a Gnostic practice guide for recognizing the ultimate source in daily life. Inside you will find the specific practice sequences developed by the Valentinian and Sethian traditions for the progressive recognition of the monad, from the initial glimpses available in ordinary contemplative practice through the deeper recognitions that sustained practice over time produces. The link is in the description below. The Allergenes, a Sethian text of extraordinary philosophical sophistication discovered at Nag Hammadi, contains what may be the most precise description in all of Gnostic literature of what the recognition of the monad actually feels like from the inside. The text describes a practitioner who has reached the threshold of the monad's recognition and is given a set of instructions for how to proceed. The instructions are almost paradoxical in their simplicity. He is told, do not know it, be known by it. Do not think about it, be thought by it. Do not love it, be loved by it. This reversal, from active seeking to receptive recognition, from the practitioner approaching the monad to the monad approaching the practitioner, is the precise description of what the Gnostic tradition calls the stillness, not the stillness of effort suppressed, the stillness of effort completed, the point at which the seeker has sought as far as seeking can take them, and has recognized that the next movement is not more seeking but the complete, temporary, unconditional rest of the seeking faculty, the pause between the last reaching and whatever comes after. And what comes after, what the Allergenized describes as the recognition that occurs in that stillness, is not an experience in the ordinary sense. It is more like the cessation of the sense of distance, the dissolution of the apparent gap between the practitioner and the monad, the recognition that the gap was never a spatial fact but a consequence of the movement of seeking itself. Stop moving toward the monad, and the monad is simply where you have always been. The monad is the secret exit from the Demiurge's constructed reality, not through a dramatic spiritual achievement, not through the accumulation of gnosis as a kind of spiritual currency that eventually buys liberation, through the recognition that the exit has always been available, has always been the deepest layer of your own consciousness, and that the only thing that has ever obscured it is the activity of seeking it. This is the tradition that was buried. This is the teaching the councils condemned. This is the knowledge the institution could not contain because it dissolves the very premise on which institutional authority rests, the premise that access to the divine requires mediation by something other than what you already are. You already are the exit. The pneumatic spark within you is the monad's presence inside the Demiurge's world. Recognize it, not with the straining effort of a seeker who believes recognition is far away, with the quiet, simple, completely available attention of a consciousness that has heard this and felt, in the hearing, the specific quality of recognition that the Gnostic tradition spent its entire existence trying to transmit. That feeling is not excitement about an interesting idea. That is the monad recognizing itself through you. Let it, and when it does, do not build a story around it. Do not make it the beginning of a new and more sophisticated seeking. Just stay in the recognition for as long as you can, then return to the ordinary moments of your ordinary life and notice what is different. Subscribe to the Gnostic Archive. Every week we go further in, past the concepts, past the tradition, toward the recognition that the tradition was always pointing at. The exit is where it has always been, inside. The specific relationship between the monad and what the Gnostic texts call the pleroma of all pleromas, the fullest possible expression of divine completeness within the material world, is described in the Valentinian tradition through the concept of the restoration, not simply the liberation of individual souls from the Demiurge's domain, but the restoration of the entire relationship between the material world and the pleroma that Sophia's fall disrupted. And the monad's role in the restoration is described in terms that give the individual practitioner's gnosis a significance that extends far beyond personal spiritual development. The Gospel of Truth describes the moment of the restoration as the moment when the pleroma is no longer experienced as distant from the material world, because the material world, through the accumulated gnosis of the souls within it, has become sufficiently transparent to the monad's light that the apparent distance dissolves. Not because the material world changes in its fundamental nature, but because the consciousness that perceives the material world changes in its fundamental orientation. The monad was never absent from the material world. Sophia seeded the material world with pneumatic sparks precisely to ensure that the monad would have presence within it. The restoration is not the monad returning to somewhere it had left. It is the consciousness within the material world finally developing enough transparency to recognize what was always already present within it. The monad cannot be experienced in the sense of being a new experience that the seeking practitioner eventually has. It can only be recognized, and recognition is fundamentally different from experience. Recognition is what happens when something that was always present and always known at a level deeper than thought finally rises into conscious awareness without the mediation of interpretation or narrative. It feels, when it occurs, less like gaining something and more like the dissolution of a belief that something was missing, less like arrival and more like the recognition that there was never anywhere to arrive because there was never a genuine separation from what was being sought. The Allergenes, when it reaches, the account of the practitioner's final approach to the monad uses a phrase that every serious Gnostic practitioner has encountered and that every serious Gnostic practitioner has taken years to genuinely understand. It says, stand still, not stand still as a body stands still. Stand still as consciousness stands still, as the moving, seeking, interpreting, constructing activity of the archon-managed mind becomes, for a moment, genuinely still, not suppressed, not controlled, simply absent. The way a wind becomes absent, not because something stopped it, but because the conditions that were producing it have temporarily ceased. In that stillness, in the cessation of the seeker's movement, the monad is simply what remains, not a new experience of the monad, not an encounter with the monad as something external that the practitioner is finally meeting. the recognition that the awareness that was always watching the seeker seek is itself what the seeker was seeking, that the witness of the seeking is the monad's presence within the soul, that the exit from the Demiurge's constructed reality was never in any direction the seeker was looking, not upward, not inward in the effortful sense, not after enough practice or preparation or spiritual achievement. The exit was in the stopping, in the recognition that the one who is looking for the exit and the exit itself are not two different things. This is the teaching that could not be institutionalized. This is what the councils of bishops gathered to suppress, not because it is incomprehensible or dangerous in any ordinary sense, because it is true, and a truth this simple, a truth that places the ultimate source of liberation inside the consciousness of every human being, without qualification, without prerequisite, without institutional mediation, is the one truth that no institution built on the premise of mediating access to the divine can survive contact with. The clay jar was sealed in the Egyptian desert. The text survived. You are reading it now. Stand still. Let the monad recognize itself through you. That recognition is the exit, and it has been waiting for you inside you since before you were born. The monad practice, the specific discipline of standing still that the Allergenes describes, the triple power recognition that the Zostrianos preserves, the progressive stripping away of constructed identity layers that the Sethian tradition systematized, is not a weekend retreat or a meditation intensive. It is a daily, moment-to-moment, ongoing orientation of the consciousness that the Gnostic tradition understood as the proper mode of the pneumatic soul's existence within the Demiurge's world. Not because the practice produces visible results that can be measured or displayed or compared, but because the pneumatic spark, which is by its nature already the monad's presence within the material world, naturally orients toward the monad when given the consistent space of genuine attention. The practice is not the creation of the recognition. It is the removal of the archon-generated noise that prevents the recognition from operating naturally. Begin today, not with a formal practice or a scheduled meditation period, though those are valuable. Begin in the most ordinary moment available to you right now. The awareness that is reading these words is already the monad's presence within your experience. The pneumatic spark that is responding to this teaching with the specific quality of recognition that feels different from simply learning something new, that feels more like remembering, is already what all of this has been pointing toward. You do not need to go anywhere to find the exit from the Demiurge's constructed reality. You are already standing in it. The only question is whether you are willing, in this moment, to stop looking for it and simply be it. That willingness, that single, quiet, unconditional willingness, is the beginning of everything the Gnostic tradition spent 2,000 years trying to transmit. It is transmitted now. Receive it, act on it, and subscribe to the Gnostic Archive, where we return to this territory every week, from every angle the tradition offers, until the recognition becomes so familiar that it no longer requires a teaching to produce it. The monad is the answer to every question the Gnostic tradition raises. Not in the sense of resolving those questions intellectually. The monad is beyond every intellectual resolution, including the ones this teaching has offered, in the sense that the recognition of the monad dissolves the questions by dissolving the questioner, the seeking self that was asking the questions from within the archon domain. The Demiurge's three hijacks dissolve in the recognition of the monad, because the monad is prior to the origin story, prior to the authority claim, prior to the value system. It is prior to everything the archon world has built, because it is the source from which the pleroma that preceded the archon world itself emanated. When the pneumatic spark recognizes the monad, when the monad recognizes itself through the pneumatic spark, there is, temporarily, nowhere that is not the monad. No cage that the monad is imprisoned in, no exit to be found, simply the recognition that everything, including the cage, including the demiurge, including the entire drama of fall and restoration and suppression and recovery, is arising within the awareness that the monad has always been. That recognition does not make the drama unreal, it makes it transparent, and a soul that sees the drama as transparent, that engages with the material world from the recognition of what sees it, is the soul that the pleroma sent into the Demiurge's world to do exactly this. You are that soul. The monad is your secret, and now it is no longer secret. Use it. The tradition has one more thing to transmit about the monad that cannot be left unsaid. The monad is not cold. This is perhaps the most important correction to the impression that the Apocryphon's negative theology can leave in readers who encounter it without the contemplative context for which it was written. The negations, not a God, not deficient, without form, without image, without opposite, can sound like descriptions of an impersonal absolute, a philosophical first principle, rather than a living reality with which the soul can have genuine relationship. The trimorphic protenoia corrects this directly. Protenoia, the monad's first thought, the feminine face of the ultimate, says, I moved among every creature. I am the life of everyone. I am the light that illuminates all things. I am the one who shines in everyone's heart. This is not the cold absolute of philosophical theology. This is an intelligence that moves, that cares, that is present within every consciousness, that carries a pneumatic spark, actively engaged in the process of the restoration, actively responsive to every genuine act of gnosis that the pneumatic soul within the material world makes. The monad is not the distant indifference of the unmoved mover. It is the closest thing possible, closer than thought, closer than breath, closer than the awareness that is reading these words right now. It is what that awareness is, and it is warm. The monad requires nothing of you. This is the last and perhaps the most liberating thing the tradition has to say. Every other level of the Gnostic cosmology involves some form of navigation, the archon mechanisms to be recognized, the Sophia principle to be cultivated, the pleroma to be approached, the Demiurge's hijacks to be seen through. The monad requires none of this. It requires nothing because it lacks nothing. It is not diminished by your ignorance of it. It is not more present when you recognize it, and less present when you forget it. It simply is, completely, without qualification, in every moment of your existence, regardless of what that existence contains. The entire Gnostic path, all the texts, all the practices, all the cosmological frameworks, points at something that requires nothing to be what it is. The path is not toward the monad. The path is the dissolution of the belief that you are not already in the monad. And the dissolution of that belief requires nothing more than the willingness, in this single ordinary moment, to stop believing it. That is the exit. It is not locked. It never was. Walk through it.